Well, Professor, colleagues, distinguished, all of us. Firstly, thank you for having me. Secondly, a particular thank you to Professor Shah for saying so eloquently the background of the organization I was made president of a short while ago. And I just wanted to pick up something that Professor Govinda said in his opening about a traditional history of knowledge transferring from north to south, because there's no question that in adult education it's the other way around, that nearly all of the creative and imaginative methodologies have emerged in contexts in the countries of the South and have been stolen in a creative and complementary way by colleagues in the North. Also, so although I've spent my working life in the United Kingdom, I represent an organization whose offices are in Montevideo in Uruguay and whose methodologies have been inspired by women's movements in particular in Latin America, Asia and Africa, and whose membership is global. So I think you have to start like that if you're British and you arrive, because you've much to apologize for in your past. I wanted to, or I have, I meant, I wanted to start with a quote from, or two quotes from Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania, because I think he's got a perspective that we perhaps haven't quite addressed as fundamentally during the conference as we need to before we leave. He said, the first function of adult education is to inspire a desire for change and an understanding that change is possible. And he then goes on to say about voluntary bodies, NGOs, civil society organizations, the influence of voluntary bodies will continue to be needed in order to counteract, he isn't talking about any of the SAR countries here, but the sterilizing effects inherent in organized education, and to safeguard the freedoms of both students and teachers. He concludes adult education is a highly political activity. Politicians are sometimes more aware of this than educators, and they do not always welcome the fact. So I think the context of the conference, it's important to recognize that the level of political endorsement we've enjoyed over the last 2 days is really untypical. In a global context, adult education has been increasingly on the back foot over recent years, partly as a result, frankly, of the focus in the Millennium Development Goals on universal primary education and the proper challenges of that, and the difficulties that then ensued when not only many national plans but also multilateral funding agencies concentrated their resources away from the education of adults to the education of children. And anyone who looks at the nature of real development with literacy would recognize that if you teach children into a culture in which literacy isn't practiced, it's very much easier to lose the skills. It seems to me there's no question, but like the Chinese strategy we were hearing about this morning, that you need adult and young people's education to go hand in hand. Adult learning then is about power. And it's about exclusion and discrimination. And it isn't an accident that the really welcome of the focus of this conference on women in development for sustainability and development should focus on the fact that 2 in 3 of the people in the world who don't read and write are women. And that's not only because of a failure of political will in places on the part of governments, but also the individual practices, family by family, neighborhood by neighborhood, which have marginalized women for far too long. I want to say about non-government organizations that at their worst, they can be awful, but let me talk about them at their best. I mean, they can be self-serving and dull and conservative and traditional, just like anybody else can. But at their best, they're not like that. They identify challenges, they imagine new solutions to challenges, they create new forms to meet emerging problems, and they're grounded in the lived experience of the communities they draw their particular experience from. They give a space for the voices of people. All too often people talk about the silent majorities, but of course people aren't silent, they just don't have a space for their voices adequately to be heard. And at their best, NGOs, CSOs provide that space. Their job is to speak truth to power. They mobilize the skeptical, they have a social energy, spread a sense of the joy of learning, and a sense that the world doesn't have to be like it is at the moment. It could be differently organized. They ask, who isn't there and what can be done about it? It's always the case that groups of people benefit less from any social structure. Always a case that there's a need to recognize who benefits and who benefits less. Their function in outreach work as partners of governments in the development of literacy programs is a critical one, because not everybody at every section of any society finds themselves enjoying the confidence or the trust of, or trusting in the authorities they work with. So what I'm arguing is that at their best, NGOs are uncomfortable. There's always, with governments, a tension in the relationship. Of course, they're willing partners in a world in which we just don't have enough people committed to adult learning. Good governments, good officials, and good NGOs absolutely share the aspiration of changing things. But adult educators represent the specific interest in their NGOs. We don't have, the Minister for Pakistan was speaking eloquently yesterday about the challenges thrown up by the floods, by terrorism, and the need to juggle where resources are committed by a government to react to that, as well as to make the case for adult learning. That's absolutely properly the job of governments. Our job in adult education is to say, what is the interests of adult learners and how will they best be served? The general and the particular interest are in proper tension, and our job is to respect the challenges faced by government, but also to make accessible the knowledge that we have within the field. I wanted to give an illustration, though, of the challenge they also have to give to communities. In Burkina Faso, there's a voluntary organisation called Andal and Pinal Association, which works with herders and fishers. Herders and fishers in Burkina Faso find it intensely frustrating that the school system in that country is organised on the assumption that people will be able to go regularly on a day-by-day basis from 9 to 3. And if you're at all mobile in your lifestyle, that can be very difficult to do. The herders and fishers negotiated with the voluntary body to have a more flexible system of education for their children, or rather they asked for it for their boys. And the association said, yes, of course we'll do that, but you need to be educating girls as well, and negotiated the arguments with the herders and fishers to that end. So what I'm suggesting is not only an uncomfortable relationship sometimes with government, but also initially with the communities that they serve. It's a wonderful story, the Burkina Faso one. You've now got a terrific boys and girls school system operated, complemented by their mothers and sisters coming too. So the argument is that quite close to our heart of our work is challenging people. But more important than that, really, is partnership. That the very welcome recognition by the government of India in its strategy, by Egypt yesterday in the announcement from the minister, in the experience of the collective Alpha Ujuvi that we heard with the UNESCO prize yesterday. And in my country, the role trade unions play as advocates for learning on a peer group basis, people who've been joined in saying, yes, you too could participate, illustrate the ways in which you can help government policies be achieved through creative partnership from the people who work alongside you. My own organisation, I retired last week from being the head of the National Institute of Adult Education, a kind of umbrella NGO in Britain. And we have a formal relationship with the government in England as a critical friend. Critical because it's our job to argue the case for adult learning, but a friend in that if we're going to fight the government, we tell them how privately and when privately, so that there are no surprises. It's not politics, it's properly cooperative activity. But we also end up writing the UNESCO reports for them, undertaking research, helping them with their policy papers, because that inevitably, an organisation like ours has concentrated more of the professional expertise and passion for this field than a government department is likely to be able to do on its own. I'm suggesting our role is as a conscience, and it does seem to me that in the arguments we've been making in Belém at the Confintea exercise and in the implementation of the Millennium Development Goals and EFA, that the International Council for Adult Education has set an agenda about ensuring that EFA 3 and 4 didn't get neglected entirely, following the previous Confintea, in which governments made a massive commitments to adult learning, and frankly, where not very much happened in very many countries. We had a convivial network of 20 or 30 researchers in 30 different countries. We took a representative sample of the countries of the world from the Human Development Index to make sure that we weren't privileging overly developed or industrializing countries. And we found there was almost no relationship between the Human Development Index score and commitment to adult learning. It fundamentally depended on political will and local expectations. So conscience is a role that NGOs play. They also play a role in research and analysis, often secondary analysis. Last year, the UN's Gender Equality Institute and ASPE, our regional partner, produced a paper on gender equality in education in South Asia, in which there's a very clear analysis of the kinds of things you need in order to make a really successful program. And they argued that you couldn't separate, of course, literacy from other anti-poverty measures, from strategies to improve maternal and child health, or to transform agricultural projects. They went on to produce, well, what are the conditions, the preconditions for a really successful program? And those, I think, then become, I've nearly finished, have I? Okay. Those become the tasks that we pass on to our colleagues in the world. We heard a bit about our advocacy training. Transnationally, you learn different things from one another, different styles of functioning. It's our task to promote and mobilize, to, in Harbens-Bowler's wonderful distinction between adult education as sector and adult education as culture. It takes learning onto the streets in festivals and manifestations where the voluntary sector is at least as capable of getting things going as its partners in the state. But I wanted to finish with a remark about Nirantar, a project in the Laliput district of Uttar Pradesh, coordinated from Delhi, where I met on Wednesday a group of Dalit women whose experience of learning involved first a struggle to negotiate in the family to be allowed to learn, secondly, the movement from learning themselves to being the coordinators and teachers of learning, and thirdly, to develop a proper coordinated campaign to make sure that the really positive legal rights for rural employment that have been adopted in India are understood, demanded on and acted on in the community in which they're serving. That's the kind of work which makes NGOs absolutely fundamental partners for government. Thank you for having me.